I call the whistle wall.
Tēnā koe te māngai o te whare. Ngā mihi o te tauhou whānau. I hope everyone had a good break. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge some of our tamariki and whānau from Weymouth Primary who are here. No mai haere mai, I hope you've had a wonderful tour of Parliament, and it's a privilege for me to speak in front of some of my constituents. I used to be a member of the Health Select Committee, and I must admit I miss it. But in saying that, I'm enjoying my new role as a member of Justice and Electoral Select Committee, but it is my privilege to speak in support of this Home and Community Support Payment for Travel Between Clients Settlement Bill. And as others have noted, this piece of legislation actually has a few people that we should credit with highlighting this particular issue. The first of which is Judy McGregor, who was then a Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission, and she and her colleagues contributed to the writing of a document called Caring Counts, and part of the recommendations within that was fair travel for our community and support workers who actually, many of them are on minimum wage, and many of them were having to pay for the petrol between visiting clients themselves. We also owe this piece of legislation to two women, and I want to acknowledge their contribution. Tamara Badley, who is a member of the then Service and Food Workers Union, now E2, who took with her union a case to the Employment Relations Authority. And when that was written up, Tamara was on $14.80 an hour, and one particular day she'd visited 12 clients. And I think actually when we think about this piece of legislation, we have to acknowledge those who have put in the hard yards and actually created this opportunity for change. And the other one was Jenny Goodman, who, as a member of the PSA, was also involved in highlighting the relevance of this piece of legislation to her work. And again, it was very much about ensuring that our community and support workers, whilst in the community, were actually appropriately remunerated for something that actually is an essential and core part of their work. What I want to highlight really is that when the agreement was reached, so instead of going to court, the Crown came to the table with E2, with the PSA, with the Ministry of Health. But what should be highlighted is that actually the Select Committee was very considered, because we actually extended the scope of this legislation to ACC. And the reason that we extended the scope of this particular legislation to ACC was because many of the home and community support workers work in that sector, and the Minister, well, both the Minister of Health and the Associate Minister of Health has highlighted the communities that benefit from this valuable work that our home and community support services workers provide. It is to older people, it is to people with disabilities, and so this is very much about recognising that there were some changes to the negotiated agreement, and one of those was saying that this piece of legislation is relevant to those who are contracted through the Ministry of Health, but also those who are contracted through Vote ACC. What I want to highlight actually in my time is that Part B of the agreement is actually an exclusion to this piece of legislation. So what was negotiated had a Part A, and that's this piece of legislation, but what wasn't and hasn't fully been realised is Part B of the negotiation. And Part B actually is about a committee coming together to investigate two things. The first of those things is the investigation into the funding for this whole area of home and community support services. So there's an agreement that the government has with the PSA and with E2 to actually look at the funding for the sector. And the second part of the agreement in Part B was to develop and oversee the transition of the workforce to a regularised workforce. And what's that about? Actually, it's about ensuring that our workers have guaranteed hours and that the workforce is paid a living wage. So we've actually talked already about the workforce and how the workforce is valuable because the people that they're serving are older New Zealanders, New Zealanders with disability, New Zealanders living in the community that if it weren't for these 28,000 workers, some of them would be incredibly isolated. So I think there's general agreement that we value that cohort in our society. And so if we value that cohort in society that this sector services, then actually we need to value them as well. And so the most critical part, I believe, of the negotiations and the agreement is yet to be realised. And so what I do want to note is that in November last year, the government convened a joint working group on pay equity principles. And that working group, actually, what they will end up doing in the future, their work is incredibly relevant to this workforce. So they're going to provide some practical guidance to employers and employees in implementing pay equity. So they also will be working in female-dominated vocations or work. That's why it's about pay equity, because as we know, our women aren't paid as much as our men, and I want to acknowledge my colleague Sue Moroney, who is in the House, who's been a champion of this issue for many years. And so I put my hand up today in the House to say I'm a champion of this particular kaupapa, because we're actually talking about home and community support service workers. And so they are the people in our communities, mostly women, who work with the old, the aged, who work with the disabled, who provide the care and support that they need to live in dignity and to have their needs met in our communities. Now, I haven't been out with a home and community support worker, but before Christmas I had the privilege of spending a day with Mele, who's an aged care worker, and she works in a facility in Manurewa, in Bupa, Hayman Park. And so I spent a day with Mele. I walked a day in her shoes, and now I know the type of work that she does, Mr. Speaker. And the type of work that Mele does is to look after about 10 to 12 people, which includes bathing them. It includes preparing their breakfast. For some of the people, it includes feeding them. It includes washing them. It includes changing their beds. It includes providing them lunch. It actually includes everything that we would hope for some of our family who are in those facilities, that there's someone who cares about them, who nurtures them, who provides for their well-being. And so, having experienced a day in Mele's shoes, I'm incredibly committed to ensuring that this sector of our workforce, of our society, who do amazing jobs every day to look after people who are vulnerable, people who actually are our mothers, they're our fathers, they're our brothers, but they are people that I believe, as New Zealanders, we all think that their needs are incredibly important. So I really just want to highlight that there is general support for this piece of legislation across the House. And the changes that were made at Select Committee, I just want to highlight that they were made with the consent of the unions, with E2, with the PSA, and in fact some of the changes aren't about us leading the changes, they're about those two unions coming to the Select Committee and saying, actually, this doesn't quite reconcile with the negotiated terms that were agreed by the government. And so they actually held both the government to account, but also us as Select Committee members, because we got a copy of that agreement, of that negotiated agreement, and it was about translating that into a piece of legislation that actually is underpinned by all the values and principles that helped negotiate that settlement in the first place. And so I can stand here and say I think we did an incredibly good job to uphold those principles. And I think the PSA and E2 will be incredibly happy with this piece of legislation. And as a member of E2, I'm incredibly proud that our unions are actually advocating, more than advocating, but implementing pieces of legislation like this that actually matter to working New Zealanders. So I will be monitoring Part B of the negotiated agreement, and I look forward to this piece of legislation passing expeditiously through the House. Kia ora.